August 31, 1988. Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Texas, USA. A total of 101 passengers boarded a Boeing 727, preparing to depart for Salt Lake City, Utah. The flight number was Delta Airlines Flight 1141, with an estimated flight time of approximately 2.5 hours. Earlier that day, the aircraft had arrived from Jackson, Mississippi. Some passengers were continuing on the same aircraft to Salt Lake City. This Boeing 727 was 14 years old, and aside from minor issues with the boarding door, the aircraft appeared to be in generally good condition. But no one knew that the aircraft was hiding another fatal flaw. The flight was captained by 48-year-old Larry Davis, who was serving as the pilot in command. The first officer was 37-year-old Carrie Wilson Pecor, and the third crew member was 30-year-old flight engineer Stephen Judd. While still on the ground, the flight crew reviewed the weather conditions along the route from Dallas to Salt Lake City. At the time, Dallas had clear skies and calm winds. The only point of concern was the presence of bird activity near the airport. At 8:30 a.m. local time, Delta Flight 1141 was pushed back from the gate. While the aircraft was being pushed back, the captain told his colleagues that he hadn't received his paycheck yet and asked if they had. The first officer and the flight engineer replied that they had already received theirs. During the pushback process, the pilots continued chatting about salaries and savings. Subsequently, the pilots started all three of the aircraft's engines. After a series of catastrophic air crashes in the 1970s, a new global regulation was introduced in the commercial aviation industry known as the Sterile Cockpit Rule. This rule prohibits pilots from engaging in non-flight-related conversations during critical phases of flight. Its purpose is to ensure that all discussions during these busy flight stages are related only to flight operations, in order to prevent distractions and ensure that important tasks like completing checklists are carried out in a focused environment. However, from the beginning of Delta Flight 1141's pre-takeoff preparations, the crew members disregarded this rule. Once all three engines were started, the first officer requested taxi clearance from ground control. Flight 1141 was instructed to taxi along the airport's internal taxiway system to the threshold of runway 36, a north-south oriented runway. Dallas Airport was extremely busy at the time. The crew knew they might have to wait up to half an hour for their turn to take off, so they were in no rush. During taxiing, the cockpit atmosphere remained relaxed. When the aircraft stopped on the taxiway, the captain jokingly mimicked the tower, and the first officer responded with laughter. The cockpit was filled with laughter. Strangely, during the pre-flight preparations, 2 checklists had already been completed, but they were initiated not by the captain, who was the pilot flying and responsible for leading them, but rather by the first officer and the flight engineer. This detail suggests that the cockpit environment was not just relaxed, but somewhat lax. Not long ago, following a series of accidents related to pilot error, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, conducted an audit of Delta Airlines. During the review, inspectors found that Delta's flight crews exhibited breakdowns in communication, poor coordination, and a lack of cockpit discipline. The FAA concluded that the root cause lay in improper training systems and operational manuals. They also pointed out that the airline lacked unified crew management standards. In many cases, captains were allowed to establish their own operational procedures. Although Delta had attempted to correct these deficiencies prior to the accident, the problems were deeply entrenched and not solvable through short-term training. For Delta Airlines Flight 1141, this meant that the duties which should have been led clearly by the captain were instead vaguely distributed among all 3 crew members. The issue is, when everyone is responsible, in practice, no one truly is. This dynamic would soon lead to serious consequences. Since the expected wait time for takeoff was relatively long, the captain decided to save fuel by temporarily shutting down engine number 3, planning to restart it shortly before their turn for takeoff. At Delta Airlines, this was standard operating procedure. Today, shutting down one engine during taxi to conserve fuel has become even more common. As the aircraft continued taxiing with 2 engines, the flight engineer suggested continuing with the taxi checklist. The pilots then set the takeoff speeds, confirmed the altimeter pressure settings were correct, checked that flight instruments were functioning properly, and ensured that the horizontal stabilizer was configured for takeoff. This is a fairly detailed and demanding checklist. While the pilots were performing these checks, a cabin crew member entered the cockpit. She was curious about the delay and wanted to know if the pilots had any updates on the estimated departure time. Although taxiing time was extended, entering the cockpit during taxi is prohibited, regardless of how fast or slow the aircraft is moving. This phase is still considered a critical phase of flight. The sterile cockpit rule must be followed. However, just as the pilots still operated in a way they were used to before the sterile cockpit rule was introduced, many senior flight attendants were also still accustomed to entering the cockpit during ground delays, as they had done in the past. The aircraft slowly taxied along the busy taxiway. The first officer and the flight attendant began chatting. They talked about their preferences for food and drinks and even discussed the upcoming presidential debate. All 3 flight crew members took part in the conversation, but the main exchange was between the first officer and the flight attendant who had entered the cockpit. The captain believed that since the aircraft was taxiing slowly, this did not count as a critical phase of flight and thus allowed the distraction to continue. The captain himself mostly did not participate in the conversation. The flight engineer remained focused on monitoring the aircraft's surroundings and his instrument panel. What happened next would later prove chilling. The first officer jokingly said they should talk about the flight attendants' dating habits so the media would have something to report if the plane crashed. He added that if the aircraft went down and the cockpit voice recorder was recovered, they should leave something behind for their wives and children to hear. Following that, the captain brought up the crash of American Airlines Flight 191 in Chicago, as well as the Delta Airlines Flight 191 crash that occurred 3 years earlier in Dallas. There was no way for the crew of Delta 1141 to know that on this very day, they too would become part of this tragic list of air disasters. Nearly 10 minutes after the flight attendant entered the cockpit, the captains suddenly realized that they had forgotten to switch frequencies and had failed to contact the next ground controller responsible for issuing their final taxi instructions. The first officer immediately switched to the correct frequency and contacted ground control. At this point, the conversation shifted to the birds seen outside the window. It was now close to 9 a.m., and the aircraft was 4th in line for takeoff. The flight engineer took the initiative to make a cabin announcement, informing passengers that they were 4th for departure and instructing the cabin crew to prepare for takeoff. It could be said that the flight engineer was performing duties that should have been handled by the captain. The pilots switched to the tower frequency and started engine number 3. The flight engineer then resumed the taxi checklist, a task that should have been completed much earlier. Based on the crew's estimation, they still had about 5 to 10 minutes of waiting before it would be their turn for takeoff. There appeared to be plenty of time to finish both the taxi and before takeoff checklists. But at that moment, the tower controller spotted an opportunity. They allowed Flight 1141 to move into position for an early takeoff. The controller notified the crew to taxi onto the runway. This decision caught the pilots off guard. Now the crew of Flight 1141 had to complete both the taxi checklist and the before takeoff checklist in the very limited time as they moved onto the runway. This would have been an ideal moment for the captain to request a few extra minutes from the tower to finish preparations, especially since they had already been taxiing for half an hour. But the crew made no such request. Instead, they accepted the tower's instruction and began taxiing onto the runway. Under pressure, the flight engineer quickly worked with the first officer to complete the final items on the taxi checklist. Next, the flight engineer opened the before takeoff checklist. He and the first officer hurriedly ran through the items. In truth, the takeoff briefing had never been conducted, at least not in the past 30 minutes. This briefing should have been led by the captain. Its purpose is to ensure all crew members understand how the takeoff will proceed, whether any noise abatement procedures apply, and to be aware of any hazards or unusual conditions. However, since the pilots were very familiar with departures from Dallas Airport, they skipped this step entirely. But the problem went far beyond just the briefing. Part of the checklist involved verifying the flap lever position and the flap position indicators to ensure the flaps were set for takeoff. The first officer responded, "Flaps set to 15 degrees, which was the standard answer. But in reality, the flaps had not been extended at all. Under the pressure of time, the first officer responded to the checklist by reciting what he assumed the settings should be, without visually confirming the actual position of the controls or indicators. Due to repeatedly performing these procedures, the first officer had become accustomed to reciting answers mechanically. Worse still, a recent procedural change at Delta Airlines made this type of error even more likely. Just 5 months earlier, company procedures clearly stated that flaps must be extended immediately after engine start. This was a straightforward step that left little room for interpretation by pilots. But under the new procedure, flaps could be extended at any time after leaving the engine start area. This created a gray area. After leaving the engine zone, whether it was immediately after pushback or right before entering the runway, there was no longer a clearly defined moment when flaps were supposed to be set. For a crew like Flight 1141's, if their attention was diverted, it became very easy to forget the single most critical configuration step before takeoff. Even more concerning, this procedural gray zone lacked a clear directive as to which pilot was specifically responsible for verifying flap position. At this point, Delta Flight 1141 had already turned and lined up with runway 18 at Dallas Airport. Only one final line of defense remained before this doomed takeoff attempt. But before we continue, we must ask an important question. Why is extending the flaps before takeoff so critical? After all, a small error like misplacing a lever might not seem like something that could lead to catastrophic consequences. The reason flaps are essential lies in how an airplane generates lift. Lift is the internal force that allows an aircraft to rise into the air. In fact, it's not the engines that make the plane fly. The engines simply accelerate the aircraft. What truly lifts the aircraft off the ground are its wings. Wings generate lift in several ways. Part of it comes from the air pushing up beneath the wing. Part comes from the downward airflow created as air flows over the top and past the trailing edge. Another part arises when air speeds up over the curved top surface of the wing, creating a low pressure zone that essentially pulls the wing upward. The faster the plane goes, the more lift its wings generate. But the problem is, the wings of commercial airliners are not designed for low-speed flight. They are optimized for long-duration, high-speed cruising. Aircraft like the Boeing 727 feature wings that are thin and flat. This design helps the aircraft cut through air more efficiently at high altitudes and high speeds. However, such streamlined wings become a problem during takeoff, when the plane is still moving at relatively low speeds. If the aircraft isn't flying fast enough, it encounters less air, which means it generates insufficient lift. The solution? Make the wing bigger. The larger the wing, the more air it encounters per second and the more lift it produces. This principle gave rise to flap and slat mechanisms, devices that extend from the leading and trailing edges of the wing. They increase the total wing surface area and enhance its curvature. As a result, the aircraft can generate enough lift even at low speeds, making takeoff smooth and safe. At 8:59 a.m. local time, Delta Airlines Flight 1141 received clearance for takeoff. However, at that moment, the aircraft's wings were still in cruise configuration, sleek and streamlined, entirely unsuitable for the lift required during low-speed takeoff. There remained one final layer of safety: The Boeing 727 was equipped with a system known as the takeoff warning system. This safety feature was designed to trigger an alarm if the pilot advanced the throttles to takeoff power while the aircraft was not properly configured for takeoff. However, on this very morning, when the captain advanced all 3 jet engines to takeoff power, no alarm sounded. The Boeing 727 began accelerating blindly down the runway. None of the 3 flight crew members in the cockpit realized the fatal mistake they had made, nor were they aware that the aircraft's warning system had failed. As the plane picked up speed, the pilots, unaware, continued handling the controls as usual, moving step by step toward disaster. During the takeoff roll, the flight engineer noticed an abnormal bleed air reading. Like most airliners, the Boeing 727's cabin air conditioning system relies on bleed air from the engines. In other words, a portion of the compressed air meant for propulsion is diverted to supply fresh air to the cabin. As a result, when the air conditioning is turned on, engine thrust is slightly reduced. Normally, this is not an issue because the thrust produced by jet engines far exceeds what the aircraft typically requires. But during certain takeoff conditions, such as high temperatures or thin air, the aircraft needs as much thrust as possible. No air can be wasted on the air conditioning system. In such cases, the air conditioning system must be temporarily shut off to ensure all available air is used for combustion to generate maximum thrust. To achieve this, the Boeing 727 is equipped with an automatic control system that cuts off air conditioning flow to the cabin during takeoff. Once this system is armed and all required conditions are met, it activates automatically, and an indicator light in the cockpit illuminates, alerting the pilots that it is ready to engage when needed. However, on that morning, the flight engineer noticed that the system's indicator light did not illuminate. This was highly unusual, because when the captain advanced the throttles to takeoff power, that action should have triggered one of the system's 3 arming conditions. At the time, the flight engineer simply regarded it as a strange but minor issue. He didn't give it further thought. Although the system was not armed, which was indeed abnormal, he didn't consider it serious enough to distract the pilots during their critical focus on takeoff. After all, this seemed like just another routine takeoff, and the system likely wouldn't be needed anyway. The aircraft reached takeoff speed. Captain Walish pulled back on the control yoke. The nose lifted, but the rest of the fuselage refused to follow. He pulled harder, trying to coax the plane into the air, but the main wheels remained firmly on the runway. Without the help of deployed flaps, the aircraft needed much more speed to generate sufficient lift. The airspeed continued to rise. At 158 knots, the main gear finally left the ground, but only just barely. The nose pitched up to about 10 degrees, and at the same moment, the tail struck the runway, scraping along the surface in a shower of sparks. A loud, jarring noise filled the aircraft, alarming both passengers and crew, though no one yet understood what had gone wrong. Suddenly, the control column shaker activated, vibrating violently. This was a critical warning. The aircraft was on the verge of aerodynamic stall. If the crew didn't lower the nose immediately, the plane would stall and crash. The right wing, generating slightly less lift than the left, caused the aircraft to roll to the right. The right wingtip scraped the runway, another burst of sparks. The captain barely managed to level the wings, but in his panic, he pulled back again. By now, the angle of attack was too steep. The oncoming airflow was no longer entering the engines properly. They began to flame out. The first officer noticed the engine thrust was decreasing. He misjudged it as an engine failure. In his mind, this explained everything. Why the aircraft couldn't lift off, why it was nearing a stall, why it was rolling and shaking. On the surface, all signs did resemble an engine malfunction. But in truth, the engines were operating normally. The real culprit, The flaps had never been extended. They remained fully retracted in the wings throughout the entire takeoff. However, in such a high-pressure moment, the pilots instinctively assumed that what they were experiencing had to be some kind of engine failure. And once the crew locked into that belief, they had no chance of recognizing the aircraft's actual problem. Still, this flight could have been saved. The captain only needed to do one thing: push the nose down, let the aircraft regain speed, and then proceed with the climb. Instead, he kept pulling the nose up, a move that only made things worse. The wings began rocking side to side. The captain gripped the yoke with both hands, struggling desperately to keep the aircraft level. At that point, the aircraft was only about 20 feet above the runway, skimming the ground at high speed, and the space ahead was rapidly running out.
What filled the crew with despair was what lay directly ahead: the end of the runway, and just 1,000 feet beyond it, a cluster of tall radio antenna towers. There was no room left to maneuver. The first officer pressed the radio button, intending to inform the control tower of their dire situation. But before he could utter a word, the plane slammed into the array. The right wing struck the towers first. It was instantly torn apart, and a fire ignited on impact. The aircraft rolled violently to the right and crashed into the ground. From the moment of liftoff to impact, only 24 seconds had passed. The aircraft broke apart as it tumbled across the ground. Debris scattered in every direction. Amazingly, every one of the 108 people on board initially survived the crash. But tragically, the intense fire that followed claimed the lives of 14 people, 12 passengers and 2 cabin crew members. Investigators quickly determined that the aircraft's flaps were never extended during takeoff. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder provided conclusive evidence of this. But one critical question remained: why didn't the takeoff warning system issue an alert? When the pilots advanced the throttles for takeoff, the system should have clearly and decisively warned them that the aircraft was not configured properly for departure. The investigation revealed that on this particular Boeing 727, the electrical contacts linking the takeoff warning system to the throttle levers had become corroded. As a result, the system was operating intermittently, sometimes functioning, sometimes not. Following the accident, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, ordered a comprehensive inspection of nearly 1,200 Boeing 727 aircraft in service around the world. These inspections uncovered a total of 35 issues, 12 of which were strikingly similar to the problem found on Delta Flight 114. To address the issue, the FAA issued new safety directives. The takeoff warning system should no longer rely on throttle lever inputs alone. Instead, it must directly read the actual engine power output to determine whether the aircraft is entering takeoff mode. Additionally, airlines were required to inspect the system every 200 flight hours to ensure proper functionality. However, the failure of the takeoff warning system was not the sole cause of the Delta Airlines Flight 1141 accident. Such systems are designed to serve as the last line of defense, activated only when all other safety procedures have failed. The most profound change brought about by this incident was in how airlines addressed human factors. In the aftermath, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, implemented stricter measures to ensure full compliance with the sterile cockpit rule. Major airlines updated their crew resource management (CRM) training programs, clearly defining the division of responsibilities during all phases of flight and strengthening awareness of each crew member's duties and collaborative role. From that point forward, ambiguity about who is responsible for what was no longer acceptable. Crew members began receiving specialized training on the dangers of distraction, particularly during critical flight phases. In the years since the accident, the aviation industry's emphasis on enforcing the sterile cockpit rule has grown immensely. With advances in aviation technology, newer aircraft like the Boeing 787 have transitioned to fully electronic checklists. These checklists are displayed on cockpit screens, and checklist items can only be marked as completed once the associated system has been correctly configured. Such innovations have fundamentally reshaped flight safety.